Right, welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk today about service archaeology using STATIK, a systems thinking approach to implementing Kanban, and some of the treasures that we uncovered. So I know you've all had lunch, so before we start, could we all just stand up? Get some blood flowing again. Maybe just, stretch out a little bit. Everybody managed to stand up? Yeah, no failures there. Good. Right, so who's ever run a STATIK workshop? If you have, please feel free to sit down and relax. There's a couple back there. Who's heard of STATIK? If you have, you can sit down as well. Now, everybody else who's standing up, have a little look around at who's sitting down. Those are the people you can go to with questions if Tom and I are not available. Everybody else, feel free to sit down. So now you know who to target. So quick, very brief introduction. My name's Eben Halford. I'm an Agile consultant. I'm also a certified executive coach. Been doing software for about 20 years. Been practicing Agile since about 2005. Tom?
Hi, Tom Reynolds. Really pleased to be here talking to you guys today. Like Eben, I'm also an Agile coach and trainer, multi-certified trainer, so I'm an accredited Kanban trainer. I also train in SAFe and Scrum, Scrum Alliance rep. And I know it might not look like it, so don't be so shocked, but I have been in software for over 25 years. Okay, so let's move on. So we're going to talk today about STATIK, systems thinking approach to implementing Kanban. So STATIK here, in Mike's presentation this morning, he's got a 6-step approach. We have it as a 5-step approach. And Mike, I know you've got quite a keen eye. We've deliberately left STATIK 0 off this slide for the time being, okay? So STATIK's a structured approach to implementing Kanban and uncovering what it is and how teams work and what they do. So this looks rather sequential. You can follow this process, so start with understanding your motivation for change, ending with a rollout approach. But it's not so sequential as it may appear. You may find as you get further through a STATIK workshop, you may go back and change what you previously thought you'd uncovered. So we've called this talk Service Archaeology. When we get to lessons learned, so right at the end we'll talk about lessons learned, we'll also have time for questions, and we'll tell you how we came to that term. But effectively, when we look back at STATIK and thought about what it actually did, we realised that really the first 3 steps are motivation for change, demand and capability analysis, and mapping our workflow was a bit like an archaeological dig. So we're digging into the past, digging through the history of teams, how they done their work, how work arrived, how it went through a system, how it went. And also along the way, we uncover some treasures and some interesting things, and we also uncover some skeletons, some things that are not great, so things that make the team unhappy, dissatisfactions, variability, etc. And then, when we design our Kanban system, we've now taken all these treasures and artifacts we found, we're cleaning them down, we're cleaning the mud off, we might be sticking some pottery back together, and then we're deciding how to put our treasures on display through the visualization aspect of our Kanban system. So how are we going to put our treasures and our findings in the museum for public display? Okay? And this is what we're going to take you through today. I'm going to take you through a STATIK workshop we've done recently with a team. This took us 30 hours across 6 days. That's how long it took to run this set of workshops. And we'll take you through what we've done, how we've done it, and some of the things that we found in the context of this team.
So just briefly, our client, DevOps and Environment Support Division for a large global financial services company. So pretty big, 46,000 employees. The division we were working with, 240 people. The pilot we were working with, 15 from a smaller team of about 80. So we're working with about 15 full-time equivalent. Across 3 time zones, and they're supporting a division of over 1,000. And what we discovered, it was about 48 work item requests per day on average. So this should set the scene for our little case study. So the first thing we wanted to do is understand the motivation for change, right? We need to know why. We need to have some reasons why we're changing. So we had to look at the internal and external sources for dissatisfaction. So some examples here of the internal sources of dissatisfaction. So what's delaying, hindering the progress of the work? What's stopping people from delivering it on time? What's obviously from producing a good quality product? And then from the outside, from the customer perspective, why are the customers unhappy? what are the conflicts that are arising? What's making them unhappy? So we started the dig using Speedboat. It's an odd way to start a dig, but it worked for us. I don't know if you've ever used Speedboat before. Anybody used it before? Speedboat, yeah? So it's a simple metaphor. You draw a speedboat, and then you attach a bunch of anchors to it, and then you ask everybody to write one idea per post-it note, stick it up on the board, stick it down as anchors to find out what's dragging down the speed of the speedboat. It's very helpful in these kind of facilitated situations to use metaphors, and this is a very good one. So what do we discover? Well, we discovered from the inside, from internally, that the team were very disappointed with a lack of capacity and demand planning. They couldn't understand their work very well, couldn't understand how much was going to happen, lots of chaotic bursts. There was lots of changes of priority, many external dependencies. And there was a lack of clear coordination, or they wanted clear coordination, certainly. And from the customer's perspective, there was little agreement on priorities, right? So as we discovered, there are a lot of different services involved with this team. The deadlines weren't being met. There was definitely a lack of communication, almost no communication. And yeah, a lack of knowing when stuff was going to be finished. When's it going to be done? No ETA. So you'd start something and it would just disappear into a black hole.
Okay, so the second part of a demand and capability analysis is looking for things that cause variability in our system. Variability in our system is bad. It makes us less predictable. It often frustrates the customer when we're not predictable. So we want to look and identify sources of variability so that in the future, as part of our improvements, we can attack these sources of variability and try and eliminate them or reduce them as much as possible within our system. So we create a much better flow through our system and we have more predictability. And we look at this from two different perspectives. The policies are under the team's control. That affects the time taken to complete the value-added work, i.e. delivering new items of work. And then the second angle is we're looking at external events, so things that are outside the team's control that also add time and affect their plans and schedules. So when we ran this part of our demand and capability analysis, we've done this through standard brainstorming. We had the teams in the room together, looking through and getting consensus of what they believed created variability. And we can see here the output of that. So on our left-hand side, these are policies under our control, under the team's control, or things under the control where they didn't actually have any policies. On the right-hand side, external events that create variability in our system. So a couple of examples that the team came up with that created different levels of variability is they had a policy in the system that had a lot of high specialisation, a lot of SMEs. When these SMEs weren't available, it created variability. They also didn't have any policy at all for handling late changes. So they often had late changes. They didn't have a policy for handling that. That affected other work was currently in progress. And they also didn't have a very clear policy on the requests coming in. So they often found the requests coming in were poor quality. So when they started to implement the change, this would create variability because they didn't understand it very well. They'd have to go back, try and find out, etc. Mainly external events were third-party dependencies. So it had a lot of dependencies on other external teams within the organisation. External vendors often had to contribute to the work. And also, they had the change authority board. All their, what would be production RSCs we'll talk about, had to go through a change authority board and they had to approve with different changes. Now, part of the static workshops is what we should also look at is how can we mitigate some of these things, or how can we change our policy to handle it? So an example would be if you were a software team and you were doing code reviews, separate code reviews. If you were to change that with pair programming, could you do that and wouldn't that affect risk? Likewise, with external vendors, could we interact with those people differently? Maybe we could introduce a class as a service which helped manage demand at their end. We'll talk about class as a service a bit later on. But some of the things we identified to change straight away would be, what we'd like to do would be remove the SME dependency and cross-skill teams. We would have a policy in place for our work requests coming in so we could schedule them and forecast them correctly. And we would also look at how we could improve the quality of information coming into our Kanban system. So once we'd understood this part of our system, or understood the work and the variability and the dissatisfactions of a team, we started and turned our attention to the different work. So what work were these teams doing? And we look at the work from 4 different perspectives. The sources of demand, with different workflows, with different endpoints, and with different buckets of sizes of work. And again, we've done this with brainstorming with the team. You can see this is a sheet of flip chart paper, just cut into 4 quadrants, and we completed the 4 different quadrants. So we're interested in how our work arrives, how it flows through our system, where it goes to, and how big are these chunks of work. So we'll see here some of our requests came from development teams, project managers, testers, support teams. We had audit and regulatory sources of demand, so different people, different departments requesting work of this team. Some of the different workflows, incidents, had a different workflow to requests for change, or RFCs. Okay. That had a different workflow to access control setup. So these are some of the services this team was offering. So you can think of these workflow types, a bit again like some of the keynotes this morning, think of these as services. These teams offering these services to their clients. Different endpoints, they had different teams, middle tier teams, database teams, they had different platforms, Windows platforms and Unix platforms, and then different sizes of work. So an incident, for example, is generally less than a day. RFCs anywhere between 4 and 7 days. So we start to understand the work coming into the system, how it arrives, how it travels through our system. And then we dig further. So we're now digging further into our work to understand the work. We're going down through the layers of the earth and cover more detail. And the second part of our demand analysis is looking at how the work arrives. So the arrival rate of the work, the nature of the demand, and the customer expectations. Even if those customer expectations are unreasonable, it doesn't matter at this stage. We need to understand what they actually are. And again, you'll see arrival rate here, for instance, 2 an hour. So that's the arrival rate of work coming into the system. The nature of demand is chaotic. So they couldn't predict when the work was going to arrive, but it's the very nature of the instance. But also burst. So they had lots of stuff coming in together, then it might tail back off. Customer expectations as soon as possible. Now that's different to access control setup, 1 to 3 a month. These are generally seasonal type work, so at certain times of year they tend to get requests for access control setup. And the work is either as soon as possible or planned. And we understand this information so we can then move on and create policies, which is what we do next. So once we've understood this work, we understood our customer expectations, we create policies. So policies we create. So policies, again, is mentioned this morning about cost of delay. So we have some policies which we'll build around a cost of delay model which looks at the business risk and it looks at the value creation of the cost implications of the work. So very simply, without going into all the detail of cost of delay, standard generally means as soon as possible. Expedite, we need immediately. Fixed date at some point in the future. And intangible, the sooner the better. So that's a very simplistic cost of delay model. So what we look at is when we look at our arrival rate of a work and customer expectations, we map that back to our cost of delay model. So you'll see here, our incidents, we offer a standard service as soon as possible. And we'll talk later on about the policy around what that means. You'll also notice now, we've actually identified an expedite, for instance. We didn't identify that earlier on. This came up through further conversation. So we had to go back and add expedite because there was an expectation that some incidents were emergencies. They must be dealt with immediately. And again, you'll see for access control setup, 2 services or 2 cost of delay services offered there. Standard and fixed date. So as soon as possible or needed for some point in the future. The other aspect of this part of static is to look for any SLAs. This team didn't have any SLAs, so nothing in place. And no hidden classes of service. So a hidden class of service could be something like a CTO or a CEO asks for a request, and we must deal with that immediately. Even if it doesn't actually really fit into an expedite, intangible, fixed date or standard. So we might have a hidden class of service, and we might define a policy around that service.
Okay, so now we've defined our services and how we're going to look at those around the class of service. We wanted to understand the value stream for each of those services. And that's a case of stepping through all the different stages where work gets done, where information gets added, passes on to the next person or to the next stage, more information gets added. So we had to define all of these things. You can see here on the left-hand side, we've got one for RFCs. The yellow steps there are stuff that the team had control over. The blue stuff is where they might need SMEs, and the pink cards there is where it might go off to an external team. You can see as well that often these workflows and these value streams have loops and all kinds of interesting patterns and designs in them. So we had to do this for all 9 services. One of the interesting things you want to look for are concurrent activities, things that are happening at the same time. Is there an overlap with other services? What happens when it goes off to another team? And are there any, in this case, the SMEs, the 2 pink cards, any specialist activities? Anything that might delay you, anything you might need to plan, anything you've got to look at in the future. So once we've done that, we wanted to have a look at, are there any initial changes we've identified? Right? So back to the sources of dissatisfaction. So these are those green stickies that we had. So we listed those out, and then we got the team to do a dot voting. You can see in this case they actually used tick voting. So we got them to decide what are the most pressing issues here. So they decided external dependencies, capacity and demand planning, and interestingly, probably the first time they've really thought about this, but a lack of skills and knowledge was identified. Right? So these are areas, possible areas for initial changes in the workflow and in the system.
Okay, so once we've finished that part of static, so now we're talking, we're possibly 2.5 to 3 days in to our static workshops at this point. We've now finished the dig. We've uncovered all the treasures. We understand how the teams work, for good and for bad, it doesn't actually matter, but we understand how they work, we've understood the history. And now what we want to decide is how are we going to put these findings on display? How are we going to clean our artifacts down, the treasures down that we found? We need to clean them up. Maybe we have to glue some of this pottery back together to make it a working system or a system we can visualize. And we decide how we can put this on public display. And the things we look at here as part of our design, our Kanban system, is looking at the workflows and deciding how we're going to visualize those workflows. We then look at some policies for done. What will allow a work item to move between columns? And then we want to have policies for classes of service. How do we handle different services of different classes of service? So we have clear policies and everybody understands how we do the work. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look through how we went through this element of static. So for each of the 9 services identified, as Eben pointed out through our workflow sketching, we got the team to draw out how it might look. And we actually done with the team the first 1 or 2, and then we allowed the team to do the other 7 services, and we supported the team in doing that. So you'll see here a sketch of how RFCs might flow through our system. In the green here, these are our done criteria for moving columns. Now you may find when you sketch out your workflow, you have lots of individual steps, but they may not make any sense to visualize them independently on the board. One, because they may not create knowledge, so you don't want to see it. Or secondly, they might be so short-lived activities, it makes no sense to have a separate step. So you might want to bring them back together into done criteria. So you can see here, before this RFC can move from analysis in progress to awaiting approval, they have to have a rollback plan. Okay? That's not a separate step on the board, but it's a done policy to allow it to move. You'll also see here we have some policies on the classes of service, and we'll look at them in a bit, but we have a fixed date policy there of how we handle our classes of service. So we had to do this 9 times for 9 different services. And when we'd done that, we put it all together and we created a single board, a single holistic view of all the work of this team. So what we'll see on this board here, we have our services down here. These are our 9 services with an expedite lane across the top. We identified through doing the workflow mapping that actually we had a common meta-level flow to every piece of work. So we had a committed queue, and everything went through some form of analysis, some form of implementation, some form of verification, and then went to done. We wanted to have pull indicators in the system and to visualize when work was ready to be pulled, so we used done columns. We had lanes for our different services. So this is incidents, that's production RFCs, non-production RFCs, etc. But what we do actually have is slight variations in the flow of work through each meta level. So you'll see, for example, incidents here have a big X through the verification. They don't go through a verification stage because that actually happens during implementation. Okay? But an RFC does go through verification. Over here in RFCs, you'll see here, this is a third-party team here. That's wait for approval. So that's, we wanted to visualize the work with the CAB, the Change Authority World, waiting to be approved. When it comes out of there, it goes into effectively a queue within our Kanban system here, a done column, which is a queue to be pulled within the system. So within the meta-level flow, the different services had slight variations in their own flow, and we wanted to visualize that differently. What you'll also see on the board here, we have an abandoned section. So abandoned by team or abandoned by requester. Because we had a feeling the team were reporting had lots of work items abandoned after they'd started, so we wanted to understand that. We have a section for impediments that come up in the stand-up. A section where improvements are identified, wanted to record them, so they could be added to our improvement backlog. We have our policies here, you can see on the board, and we have a key, so what the different colours of cards mean on the board. We also have our purpose of a system at the top, which we'll talk about later on. But we created a holistic view of all the work in the system. And this was the first time the team actually had a single holistic view of all the work and all the services they actually offered at any one time. So we talked about policies. So in some example policies here, incidents. Standard incidents are on white cards, so we could visualize them. The prioritization was FIFO, first in, first out, because that's what fits with the cost of delay economic model for standard. For expedite incidents, pink cards, to be an expedite, it must be a production outage, or an outage would occur within a 98% confidence interval of a standard ticket. And if you heard anybody talk today about lead time distributions and things of that nature, once you've got some data, you can quite easily calculate the 98% or even the 85% confidence interval. So you can use that for your predictability and your forecasting. We're allowed to exceed our WIP by 1, and we'd take all necessary resource off other work to work on the expedite. So we had a very clear policy about how we handle this item of work. So there's no surprises to anybody. Likewise, an access control setup, which is fixed date, is a green card. We're going to hold this in the backlog again until the 98% confidence interval, because it's not required for fixed date, so we don't want to start it too early, because we might lose opportunity elsewhere, but also we don't want to deliver late. But we could also expedite it in a certain instance. And intangibles are blue cards, and we'd always have one improvement in the system at any one time. So very clear policies about how we've done the work.
So the next very important thing we wanted to look at was WIP limits, right? Work in progress limits. So what we did was we took the team of approximately 9 full-time equivalents or 15 actual individuals. And we worked with them, had a little bit of a chat about it. We have to guess to start with what we're going to do. So we decided we were going to have 18 as the total WIP for the entire board. And then, of course, we divided it up to where we thought most of the work would be done in the vertical columns. And then we did capacity planning based on expertise and number of people in each of those various different sections for the different types of work. Right, so you can see they get a lot more incidents there than they do RFCs, and only a couple of these. Now, can anybody, what does everybody think of that WIP currently? Got a WIP of 18, in fact 4 on analysis. Well, at least we know we've broken it hugely. That's one thing. So they've never managed to stick to their WIP yet, but then we haven't tried very hard just yet. But at least we know where we are. At least we know what we should be doing or trying to do at the very least. And of course, if you're gathering all your metrics, you can show very easily what happens when WIP increases, right? Your lead time explodes. It takes a lot longer to do everything. And they're now starting to actually get to terms with that as a real concept. So another important thing, of course, you've got to design your cards. Kept a relatively simple card design here. Got a work item type. It's fixed date, not fixed date, when we committed to it, when it's finished, description of the work. We had a reference number up there because we're referencing back to an electronic system as well. We've got some additional information, which is always important. We've got blocked work items with a red dot, blue dot for something that's blocked due to a defect that the team have created. And then, of course, you write the defect down on a separate little card. And on the back of the card, we're recording the start and end points for work entering each of those columns, right, when they move state. So that's another important thing to know. The other important thing is to agree a cadence. Right, so with all of this stuff, apart from the fixed date stuff, of course, it's release it as soon as you're done. Get it out there. People want this stuff. They're incidents. Get it out there. We had several handovers. We had 3 time zones, right? So we have 2 physical handovers and 1 handover at the end of the day by email. So we got one between EMA and APAC and another one between EMA and Americas. So this is one of the points where they do replenishment and when they decide which pieces of work they're going to do and when they start committing and pulling the work. And if they're lucky enough to run out of work, then they can replenish on demand.
Okay, so static 0. So static 0 might tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the way it's documented, normally you do static 0 first, hence the 0. Is that right?
That's how David describes it.
That's how David describes it, okay.
In practice, I think it's often easier to do it a bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually done static 0 as the very last thing. Not because we particularly deliberately planned it that way, it's just the way it actually happened. And in hindsight, and in retrospect, when Eben and I have gone back to think about this and talk about this, we probably think it probably worked better at the end. Because had we done this at the beginning, we probably would have got a purpose of our system of things like, well, we just fix instance, or we deploy production RFCs. Now that isn't the purpose of this team. That's things that they do. I'm not going to read out the purpose, but there's a purpose there. But fundamentally, the purpose of this team was to help the delivery teams, the software teams of this big department, release stuff into production and deliver on the return on investment more quickly. So that was really the purpose of the system. And when we've understood the purpose of a system, what we then look at is what makes us fit for purpose. And we look at this across 3 different perspectives. Fitness for purpose on lead time, fitness for purpose on predictability, and fitness for purpose on quality. So the team decided we haven't yet gone back and verified this with the customer. We will do. We have done some verification with the customer on their level of satisfaction with this team. But maybe Eben might mention that in lessons learnt. But we had some fitness for purpose. So to be fit for purpose on standard internally completed incidents, they expected they should be able to complete that between 2 hours and 1 day. And they should be able to do that 95% of the time. For externally completed instance, which is outside their control, between 3 and 10 days, 80% of the time. No quality metric here because either incidents are either done or not done. Okay? However, production RFCs, fixed date class of service. So again, we had fitness for purpose criteria for each class of service, for each different service or work item this team handled. So they didn't want to be able to deliver no later than the due date if accepted by the CAB, 100% of the time. So 100% due date performance is what they believe is fit for purpose. Now, we did question the team on this. Do you really think that's reasonable? 100% of the time, but they were quite insistent. Time will probably tell if you start to capture the metrics. And the quality metric was no more than 5% of rollbacks on any production RFCs put into a live system.
So then the final thing we do is agree a rollout approach. You can't just jump in there and start doing it without agreeing stuff with your customers, upstream and downstream. So just to rewind a little bit, one of the reasons why we got involved with this team was that there was a large agile team that they're supporting, and that agile team wanted to spread their agility up and downstream. They didn't want to be quite so constrained by the way their business partners were working, so they asked us to help them implement this Kanban. So we started with one small team. Did the workshops, looked at extending it up and downstream. Very importantly, we shared all of the findings, we didn't hold anything back, with all the stakeholders and with the customers. I think Tom mentioned this, one of the important findings there was the Net Promoter Score was pretty low. I think if anybody had a choice, they wouldn't be working with this particular team. So that was definitely a good reason to change. And certainly when we shared our findings, they were very, very happy to move forward with everything that we discovered, essentially. The plan then is, after showing some improvements, and we have seen some improvements, we haven't really done a lot of extreme coaching with them or anything like that. We've just exposed it, and we'll go on in a minute, we'll talk about, that's one of the reasons why we called it archaeology. But we have seen some improvements just from them being able to see their work. A lot of the time, this is a new thing for them. You know, they're normally so busy, head buried in doing the work, that they don't see the whole picture. And this is one of the first times, you know, Tom said 6 days, I think we spent, first time they actually get to look at their work. And here, another very important thing, we collected a number of improvement ideas from the team during the workshops, and then subsequently, whilst they're having discussions around the board, they're coming up with all kinds of interesting ideas. And again, this is probably the first time they've ever felt like they've had the opportunity to do this, which is great. So that's how we approached the rollout. Some lessons learned. So why did we call it archaeology? I think we were in a meeting and people were accusing us of having changed things. Oh, what's going on here? What's all this? What's all this? And we said, look, we haven't changed anything. And just actually what we've done, like archaeologists, we've just uncovered what's happening. So that's why we chose this metaphor. It might be useful for you as well. It certainly helps us to let people understand that we haven't really changed anything. We're just uncovering it and then putting it on display. Very important to get everyone involved, right? Definitely the whole team. Definitely management, if you can get them in there. The last thing you want is people popping in and out and sending you right back to the beginning. The last thing you want is team members who couldn't make it for whatever reason. I mean, we had people flying out from different parts of the world. Because, of course, you want everybody to be on the same page, have experienced the same stuff, and to understand similar things at least. And again, this is probably the first time they've ever thought holistically about their work. It's not often that they get a chance to do that. And, as Tom mentioned, be prepared for the workshops to take a bit longer than you initially thought. And you have to use good facilitation. Not that that will make it shorter, it'll probably make it longer because more stuff will come out. But again, a lot of these people that we work with haven't ever really thought about their work before and haven't been to workshops and haven't been asked to think about things, so they need to be facilitated. And again, static 0 or static 10, as we're probably now going to call it, work quite well at the end. So, that's us. Any questions?